You're listening to Simple Health Radio, the podcast about recognizing medical emergencies and promoting wellness. Your host is Dr. Emron, an experienced ER physician who has treated thousands of people just like you. Information on the show is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Always talk to your doctor or go to the nearest emergency room with any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Simple Health Radio. Recently, one of our online followers sent in a great question. His name is Al, and he's the host of the podcast called The Depression Files. Let's have a listen.
Hello, my name is Al Levin. I'm the host of The Depression Files. You can find the podcast at thedepressionfiles.com. I interview men who have been through depression. The goals of the show are to educate people around what depression really is, as well as other mental illnesses. It's also to support men or others who may be struggling with depression. And finally, it's to chip away at the stigma. So, my question for you, Dr. Emron, is, I have heard amazing things about EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, as far as therapy for trauma. I am curious if one can utilize EMDR therapy prior to experiencing any PTSD symptoms. So, for example, if someone has been through a horrific situation, perhaps witnessing a murder, for example, something that you know would classify as trauma in anybody's book, could one start to immediately receive EMDR therapy prior to experiencing any PTSD symptoms? Thank you.
First, let me thank Al for sending in a great question. You can visit Al's podcast, which also has a blog and other great resources, by checking out his website, www.thedepressionfiles.com. He interviews people on his show and provides resources to help manage depression and mental health issues. It's definitely worth a listen.
The Filmmakers Podcast, presented by Damian Swaby, is a small fraction of the critical conversations currently taking place across the indie film community. The podcast reaches out to the next generation of filmmakers who continue to look for inspiration and guidance. Some of the guests you'll hear on this podcast have been Oscar-nominated, Emmy Award winners, and like many other filmmakers, they are giving it their all in the world of filmmaking.
Now, PTSD stands for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, and PTSD is triggered by trauma. Now, trauma comes in different types. Medically speaking, there are about 30 specific types of trauma that we know are linked directly with PTSD. There are many others, but these are the most common. For example, anyone who's been through the military, people who've been through war, either as civilians or as combatants, sexual assault, domestic violence, unexpected deaths in the family, car accidents, and terrorist attacks. All of these can trigger PTSD. Now, it can also occur in people who've survived natural disasters. These include things like house fires, tornadoes, flooding, and earthquakes. So those people who survive those events also can develop symptoms of PTSD. Now, how common is PTSD in the United States? Well, it's estimated that about half of the population will go through one of those 30 types of trauma that we just mentioned at some point in their lifetime. That's roughly 150 million Americans. Now, out of that number, about 10% of men and about 20% of women will develop PTSD symptoms for at least 1 year. So again, about half the population goes through some type of trauma, but between 10 to 20% of those will meet the criteria for PTSD, and they have all of the symptoms that would be present. Now, the PTSD may not last the entire lifetime, but the symptoms can develop for a significant portion, and those people will suffer as a result of it. Now, what are some of the issues with PTSD that makes it different than just simple anxiety or depression? Well, it's a little bit complicated because PTSD has psychological symptoms as well as physical symptoms. And each person's experience can be very different, even if they live through the same event. Now, there are 4 common symptoms that a majority of people will have, so I'll talk about each of those 4 things briefly. Now, the first of those symptoms is reliving the event over and over again. This could be through flashbacks or nightmares. These are often triggered by simple things like certain shows on TV or hearing fireworks in the neighborhood. These people who've lived through a military experience or a war zone, they often are having flashbacks about gunshots or being back in their home countries or back out in the field whenever they hear fireworks or something on TV that reminds them of a combat. Now, another common thing is to avoid anything that reminds them of the event. For example, you may avoid certain people or places that have anything to do with that trauma. For example, if someone was involved in a car accident on a specific street in the neighborhood, the person will go the long way around and completely avoid that street whenever possible because they're so afraid their symptoms are going to come back or that they're going to have another accident. Now, other times, people will have extreme amounts of negative thoughts, and these can include guilt or shame about the event. And that's true even if they had no control whatsoever over the event. For example, if there was an apartment fire and you were just walking by on your way to the neighborhood store, the fire could have been going on for 30 minutes even before you arrived. There could be firefighters and ambulance and all kinds of medical personnel trying to save the victims. But some people actually develop guilt because they didn't run into the building themselves to save the child or the person who died in that house fire. Now, there's nothing that could have been done realistically, but those people have PTSD just from witnessing that event and being in the vicinity. So those negative thoughts can become overwhelming. And then the last common scenario is something called hyperarousal or hypervigilance. Basically, these people are always on edge. They feel very, very uncomfortable. They have a hard time sleeping. They have a hard time focusing and concentrating. They look almost paranoid, and they're always looking around corners, even in their own homes. They're always looking for a safe place to be, and they think everything is threatening to them. They could be just going to the mall or just going to the neighborhood library, and they startle very easily, especially if you approach them unexpectedly or in a threatening manner. People are very easily overwhelmed, and it causes an impulsive nature that oftentimes leads to alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and suicide. So again, these are the 4 common traits that we talked about, and what we're trying to do is prevent suicide in the people who have severe PTSD symptoms. So now that we talked a little bit about the foundation of it, let's talk about some of the treatment options that are currently available. There's really 2 pathways that most people will end up following. The first one involves medication. The second pathway involves psychotherapy. So I'm going to talk about both of those pathways, but first I'm going to talk about the medication route because there's several different treatments that are available just on the medications. Now, we talked about the psychological sensations of people who have PTSD. If they have trouble sleeping, if they have a lot of flashbacks or nightmares, there's a medication called prazosin, which is highly effective. Now, prazosin is an alpha blocker, so it's actually a low-dose blood pressure medication. For some reason, it really works well for anxiety, and it helps to control the heart rate, and it helps people sleep. So it's not a sleep aid. It's not like Ambien or Lunesta or anything you would buy over the counter. It's a prescription medication, but it really works well to help people sleep. And allowing people to get deep sleep and control their PTSD goes a long way to helping them recover. The second category is going to be things like antidepressants, and these are called SSRIs or SNRIs. So the S stands for serotonin. Now, there's many medications in these categories. Some of the common names are Prozac, fluoxetine, Cymbalta, and Effexor. You may have seen some of these names on TV. Some of these medications are generic, which means they're very cheap, and they're inexpensive, meaning they're more affordable and available to a larger number of people. Other medications are brand name, which is going to be more expensive. But all of them work on the serotonin pathway. Serotonin is a chemical in the brain. It helps to regulate our mood. It's a biochemical reaction. These medications, whether it's an SSRI or an SNRI, they both work in a very similar way to slowly stabilize the mood. The goal, though, is that you have to be on the medication every single day. So it's not as needed. This is a daily regimen. It's a commitment. And you have to be on the medication for at least 6 months, oftentimes longer, to get the full benefit. Now, the people who respond well to this medication, they should stay on it. They should not take themselves off the medication. They should not stop it cold turkey. The medications are safe, and they're very, very effective. Now, I understand. Some people say, I don't want any medication at all because I'm afraid I'm going to get addicted to it. I'm afraid that there are going to be stigma and other issues with it. And that's true. I completely respect that. But again, the medications are effective, especially if you're having trouble focusing at work, if you're having issues with your relationships at home, if you're not able to leave your house, if you're constantly paranoid, if you're having trouble sleeping or eating, then something has to be done. So medications are a bridge. They can get you from a very dark place to a much better place, but it is a commitment that you have to really discuss with your doctor, your pharmacist, and your family, and then stick with it. Now, the second thing is that what if there's only a partial improvement? So let's say someone starts Prozac at a low dose and they're about 50% better after about a month or two. What is the next step? Well, the next step is either to increase that medication to a maximum dose or to add a second medication. So a lot of people actually need 2 medications to control their symptoms and to help their depression and their anxiety. And if that 2 medication combination works better, then take 2. Then that's what you need. That's what you're going to stay on long term. Now, if there's people who really are opposed to medication or they've already maxed out their medication and they're still not getting better, then we would add in psychotherapy. So that's the other pathway that we talked about. Psychotherapy, there's several different types, but they are always handled by a professional. So either it's going to be a psychologist, a chaplain, a psychiatrist who's really trained to deal with these difficult emotions of PTSD. Those are the people that I would refer them to, because this is not going to be your general family doctor or surgeon or someone that's in the family. This has to be a professional. Now, what we call CPT is cognitive processing therapy. So this is a way to address the negative thoughts. Remember, we talked about guilt. We talked about why everything is so dangerous. We talked about some of the anger issues that people develop, and they just can't really vocalize them with their family or friends. So a therapist will work through those specific steps with cognitive processing therapy, and they will develop worksheets, coping strategies, and there's some homework that these people have to do when they go back home to their community, to their workplace, and so on, to help address those issues. Now, the other method is called EMDR, and that stands for eye, movement, desensitization, and processing. Okay, so that's called EMDR, which is eye, movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. This is the question that Al from the Depression Files was really focused on. Now, EMDR is very unique. It's a therapy where the therapist or your psychologist will actually ask you to talk through and relive the full trauma. And that sounds very scary at first because, again, we talked about how people really avoid it. They don't want to discuss it. They don't want to go to those streets. They don't want to go through any of those neighborhoods because they're afraid it's going to trigger that. Now, again, we talked about these are professionals. So you're going to do a one-on-one session in a quiet room with the therapist present, and the therapist is going to ask you to talk through it, relive that full trauma. While they're going through that process, the therapist is going to do EMDR. So let me talk about that in just a little more detail. It involves the eyes of the patient and the fingers of the therapist. So that might sound a little bit odd, but basically the patient is going to be asked to talk through their experience that led to the trauma while the patient is looking at the fingers of the therapist. And the therapist is going to be moving their fingers back and forth in a specific way. It almost looks like hypnosis, but it's not hypnosis. This is a psychological treatment, and it's extremely effective. So let's go through an example.
You may not know it yet, but you definitely want to subscribe to the Health Science for the Rest of Us podcast. It's a show where we explore the body.
Are you smelling your armpit?
Body odor. Its shenanigans.
Actually, my menopause and perimenopause. Is this the part where I can talk about me?
And the world of fascinating ways we try and keep it healthy.
Can you just be a human guinea pig professional?
Yes. So according to the internet, you are not pregnant. You have a urinary tract infection.
Oh, no.
Full episodes with me, I'm Terrell, and my very fun special co-hosts are available now at healthscienceforeveryone.com or your favorite podcast app. So subscribe now. Tell your friends to subscribe and brace yourselves for all the health science adventure you can handle.
So let's say we have a patient who went through a very serious car accident. The accident happened 2 years ago, but that person has not been able to drive on the highway ever since then. So 2 years ago, the accident occurred and they developed severe PTSD. That person no longer goes out with the family. They don't go to football games or concerts. They don't go on road trips. They basically just drive in the neighborhood to and from work. So the therapist might ask the patient to tell the full event in a story fashion. So let's say the patient was driving home from work on a Friday night. Maybe it was 10 p.m. They were listening to some rock music on the radio, everything is going well, and then all of a sudden